On the other hand, I can give myself applause with the new Teams, so feel free to use that feature liberally if you haven't found it yet. Okay, so that's the recording started. All right, so anybody get anything else from last week or in general that they want to bring up, talk about? Questions, comments, issues? Nope. Okay, in that case, we'll jump straight into this week's lecture. And as I said, we're just basically following the order that it's shown on Moodle. So last week we finished off governance. This week we're moving on to risk. A reminder, you should be thinking about this in terms of the case study. I'm assuming you've read it in detail. So think about the issues for that organisation as we're going through this. Now, when we're done with this, we'll have a tutorial. And again, the tutorial talks about an organisation, but clearly you'll want to be thinking about it in terms of the case study organisation. So once we've finished the lecture, you can go into starting to create those documents, and those will then feed into your final report. But for the moment, let us get started. Okay. So today is about risk management. And anyone want to tell me why it's called risk management and not risk avoidance or risk removal?
Because risks are always potential, even current risks.
Yep. You can't go through life without taking risks. It really is that simple. So the only thing that you can do is try and anticipate them and plan for them. Because organizations are the same as us. Everyone takes risks. You know that you do. When was the last time you got to a crossing, pressed the button and thought, actually there's no traffic, I'll just wander across even though the wee man's at red? That's a risk. You took it anyway because you weighed up the surroundings, you thought about the possibilities, and then you went ahead and took the risk. So risk avoidance is a strategy. Risk removal is impossible. So even some of the international standards, so I've flagged up ISO 31000 there, and you should go and look at ISO 31000 because it's the international standard for this kind of stuff. It's not saying don't have risk. It's not even saying don't take a risk, because actually sometimes you will want to take a risk. Starting an organization, starting a business is a risk. If you wanted to not do that, you wouldn't start the business. But what you're trying to do is mitigate and reduce all the uncertainties that you can. So when you're waiting to cross the road, you don't just think, yep, let's go. You minimize, you look around, you listen. You think, is there any traffic coming? Doesn't mean you won't get mown down by a jet black silent Tesla that you've neither seen nor heard, but you're taking the risk anyway. The important thing for risks isn't to try and pretend that they don't exist. It's quite the opposite. It's to understand that they exist, identify what they are, and manage them. Because, of course, we do it all the time, and I've already used the example of crossing the road. 5 years ago, there were over 180,000 road traffic accidents in the UK. Almost 1,800 people died. If we were trying to get rid of the risk, we would, I don't know, stop people crossing the road, stop building roads, not allow people to drive. Any of those things would stop people dying crossing the road, but we don't do them because we want roads and we want cars. So instead, we identify as a risk and start to think about things that we can do to address that risk. We manage road traffic accidents rather than get rid of roads. We can use avoidance strategies. If you don't want to be hurt crossing the road, don't go near a road. Avoid them. Stay in bed. I mean, it's not practical, although, as I've said on the slide, I have known a whole pile of students who think it's entirely reasonable to spend the whole term in bed. But for most of the rest of the population, you can't do it. So instead, you try and educate. Nobody's got their camera on, so I'm only going by a couple of pictures that are on the screen. I'm guessing that none of you are old enough to remember the Tufty Club. Anybody?
No.
No.
Well, clearly I'm not old enough to remember either. But as I understand it from my grandparents, the Tufty Club was what you got kids to enrol in. They used that to learn about crossing the road. And there's been loads of these. Green Cross Code, look right, look left, look right again. I'm sure some of you have had that. There was the Think campaign. There were dozens of these. So they taught children about crossing the road. They put out adverts, wee booklets, all to try and get children to understand the safety issues with roads and to stop them being hurt. I wonder, he says incredibly slowly, exactly how slowly I can be when introducing this whilst waiting on my browser catching up on itself. The answer is, of course, very, very slow indeed. This is truly horrendous. I'm wondering whether I'm just better rebooting my machine and trying to get a better response. Right, this isn't doing anything. I'm going to reboot my machine. rather than having you hang about, I'll make it 11:30. Well, I'll give you guys a 10-minute break and I'll try and get these things sorted out and we'll come back at 22.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sounds good.
Right. Okay, I'll leave the meeting open. I'll leave it, but
There is a reminder for Tony.
shush. Okay, so I'll be back in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm back, albeit still incredibly slowly. I've rebooted. I have stopped OneDrive trying to synchronize, but there's something I can't stop, which apparently is a system task that tries to recover from an incorrect update. So I'm guessing that I was updating. That's what was going so slowly in the background. That's what was stopping everything. And now that I've rebooted, it's now trying to recover from that bad update, taking just as much CPU and memory as it did before. So we shall see how we get on. You're all very quiet. I take it you can't hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
I thought I just said all that and I was out of it. Right, okay, so we were talking about risk. And for those of you that haven't heard of it, here is the Tufty Club.
This is what happened one day when the ice cream van stopped by Tufty's house. Ice cream! And Tufty goes to find his mummy. Tufty always asks his mummy to go with him to the ice cream van. But Willie Weasel has gone off to get an ice cream by... Weasel has gone off to get an ice cream by himself. Oh, dear! Oh, Mummy! Willie has been knocked down by a car. Now Willie has been hurt. And
Well, it's going well so far.
all because he didn't ask his mummy to go with him to the ice cream van. When you want to go to the ice cream van, all...
So that was how people were taught to cross the road in the early 70s. It did, of course, move on and became far more polished. And relatable, because they used a superhero next that they made up for themselves. Bonus points if you can tell me who this guy is. Oh, this is just appalling. I'm really sorry about this. I don't know what else I can do.
I'll answer your question. It's David Prowse anyway, because he was Darth Vader.
He was Darth Vader. And what happened with his role both as Darth Vader and as a Green Cross Code man?
Hi there. Uh-oh, this looks dangerous. Will they see that car?
Don't know. I can't see the car.
Think I better have a word with those two. That wasn't very clever, was it? If you'd been looking and listening all the way across, that wouldn't have happened. That's better. Remember, always use the Green Cross code, because I won't be there when you cross the road.
So, for the kids, they decided, yep, okay, there is a risk in crossing the road, but we can't stop them living, we can't stop them being around, so we have to do something to mitigate it. So they put in place training, education, to try and teach children how to cross the road safely. Whew. Really sorry, this is just so slow. I promise I have clicked on the button to get it to go back to the presentation.
It's probably slow 'cause it's still trying to load that YouTube video in your tab by the looks.
Now Teams is back to taking 2 gigabytes of memory, which doesn't help. Okay, so risks exist. We cannot always simply say we're not going to engage with that risk. So what we do instead is try and think about risks and do something about them. For road traffic, it is educate, but for us there may be other things that we want to do, and that's part of what I want to think about just now. And when I said now, it was meant to advance the slide. There we go. So we don't just identify the risks, we try and manage them. So for that process, there are, depending on what books you read or what articles you read or which person you listen to, there'll be different approaches. So like I said last week, the stuff that I'm giving you isn't a definitive answer, because there probably isn't a definitive answer. But what it is a reasonable approach. So it's a reasonable set of risk management options. And they are to accept risk, avoid it, transfer it, mitigate it, or exploit it. So we'll have a look at what each of those involves, but we may have to do it very slowly. Oh, come on. So, first thing we might want to do with a risk is simply to accept it. Just say, nope. Risks are part of life. You have to take risks to do anything. What's the old thing? If anyone who Anyone never took a risk and never took anything? I don't know, something like that. Point is, you have to do things, and if you do anything, there's a risk involved. So you accept it and you go, yeah, okay, if that happens, such is life. But that's only useful if the risk that you're accepting is small. Now, small, once again, is a movable feast. So you have to define what small means. Because small might be defined in terms of finance. And if somebody loses a USB stick, financially, that's a small risk. It's a £5. But the data on that USB stick might be potentially worth millions. So the risk of them losing a USB stick suddenly becomes that much higher. So you have to define your terms when you're saying small risk. You have to think about the different types of risk, which involves thinking about the different types of outcome were this to go ahead. The other side to that coin is very high risks. You may, in your organisation, think about things that might happen to your organisation and what you're going to do about them. What you probably don't do is think about the effect of a global pandemic, because the risk is very low. But of course, that doesn't mean it can't happen, as we all now know. It was on very few people's risk registers. It was on government's risk register. But again, as we've seen with the response, it was still pretty much ignored. So the effects were known, but there was very little put in place to try to mitigate the effects, which is why you saw all sorts of issues with things like protective equipment and worries about hospital beds and so on. Because even though they understood there was a risk, they decided that they were not going to devote the resources to that risk. And sometimes that's okay. Your corporate headquarters may be under risk of a meteor strike. There's probably no point in you planning on it. Although, of course, that may depend on who you are and where you work. Because for some people, planning on a meteor strike is incredibly important. So if you work in the International Space Station, understanding what will happen if you're hit is important, not just to the structure, but for people's lives. So you can see there the International Space Station has been mapped out in terms of the effect that it would have on impact. The dog has also carried out its own assessment risk and decided to try to mitigate the risk of being hit by a meteor with a hat. But that's only because dogs are stupid. So that's one approach. We can accept risks. We can also try and avoid risks. Think about what the risks might be, understand how they might approach and what might be done about them, and try for that not to happen. So, for example, the financial year for a lot of organisations ends at the end of March and starts in April. What that means is annual accounts are created towards the end of that financial year, and while it goes on all year, it does tend to get busier in March. Well, if you know that that's happening, you know when the accounts have to be ready, you know when they have to be filed, it's probably a bad idea to let your accounting staff decide to take an annual holiday in March. You know it's coming up. why would you take that risk? So you avoid it by not allowing your staff to go on holiday. But you don't know to do that unless you have identified the risk, unless you have thought about what might happen, thought about how it would affect you, and thought about ways around it. So you can avoid risk. And if you can't avoid it, maybe you can transfer it. We almost all transfer risk. If you're a driver, you are legislatively mandated to transfer risk. By which I mean, if you have an accident when you're driving and break someone else's car, you're responsible for fixing it. And to avoid the chance that you're unable to do that, the law says that you must have insurance. Which means that if you break someone else's car, they will be compensated. It is only someone else's car. As you probably are all well aware, the term is third party. So the transfer of risk is only as it pertains to other people. It's up to you whether you want to cover your own car. And you take that risk in all sorts of places. Do you have insurance for your car, for your house, for your life? The idea being, rather than thinking, what would happen if my house burned down? How would I pay for it? You transfer that risk to other people. Or to be more precise, everyone takes on the risk of everyone else. And by doing some calculations, by working out how many people's houses go on fire every year, you figure out how much it will cost if everybody chips in a wee bit to cover everybody for everything. We actually work in exactly the same way with health services. We've decided it's better that everybody can be cured if they get sick, but not everybody gets sick. Unless you're a particularly unempathetic person, you don't sit thinking, my goodness, my taxes are going into paying for the hospital and the doctors and nurses and all the rest of the stuff, and I've never been sick in my life. Hopefully what you think is, well, thank goodness I've never been sick and I've never needed to avail myself of those services. So we all kick in for everyone's health coverage. So transferring risk can be really helpful. The problem comes when you can't just put a figure on it. If my car gets damaged, the insurance company actually won't pay for what that means for me. In other words, getting a new car, having to source it, running about getting it. What they'll pay is their estimate of what the car costs. So they've got a book somewhere that says, your car is worth this. Now, it's unlikely that their number corresponds to what I think I need from a car. Of course, you can pay more to different insurance companies to bridge that gap. But you're still setting a number. You're deciding what the number is. If the number's lower, your insurance is lower. If the number's higher, your insurance is higher. But what about where it's not so clear? What if, for example, you do some procurement? So you procure a company to come into your organization and install a flood network, to put in all the routing capabilities, all the cybersecurity facilities with firewalls and DOS stuff and everything. What is your cost for that not happening? So say you're setting up a new building. It has to be done by the 1st of June. What does it cost if it's not done by the 1st of June? Well, the actual cost is zero. It doesn't cost you anything because you've paid for a service, and that service will eventually get done. So in that sense, you haven't lost anything. But of course, that's not the full cost, because if you wanted it done by the 1st of June, that's probably because staff were coming in on the 2nd of June. So the cost of your network not going in and everything not being ready isn't just the cost of some routers and the cost of some Cat5 or some fiber or whatever it happens to be. It's the cost of 500 people in a call center being paid and not being able to do any work. Even then, you can probably put a number on that to some extent. So you could say, right, well, if it's not in on time, you're going to pay the cost of all these people's salaries, and you will cover any other ancillary costs. Fine. That's the identifiable cost, but presumably you had a call centre for a reason, to answer questions from people that phone up. What's the cost to your business of not answering the phone? How much does it cost your business if people can't get in contact with you? It's kind of hard to know. Was it an idle inquiry where somebody wants to know your postal address so that they can send you a letter? Or was it a multinational company looking to hire your company for a 10-year contract at 10 million a year? You never got the phone call, so you don't know. It's very difficult to put numbers on it, and it's very difficult to understand what the outcome might be. But you're going to have to. You're still going to have to think about it, and you're still going to have to put a number on it. And you could say, well, I might lose 100 million from this contract, at which point the insurance company will go, that's fine, but we will charge you a premium that's commensurate with us having to pay you £100 million. And at that point, the cost of the premium might become higher than the risk of the project not coming together on time. So there's a balance to be found in there, as there is for you insuring your car. Do you say, I'm a good driver, I'll be fine, I will take out the minimum insurance that I have to do to cover third-party drivers? Do you say, well, I've just got myself a new car, I don't want to take the chance, I know it will cost me more in insurance, but I would rather have that peace of mind so that if anything does happen, I'm covered for it? The answer in the end will come down to your assessment of the risk and how much you want to pay. That's exactly the same when you start to think about those risks for an organisation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So the next thing we could try and do then is to mitigate the risk. Thinking about what risks you might have, recognizing that they exist, but thinking about how you might go about minimizing anything that happens as a result of that coming true. But again, there's balance. So you'll, at some point in your careers, I'm quite sure, be running some servers somewhere. The servers will be no doubt integral to your organization's day-to-day running, because most IT things are these days. So you're going to have to make a decision. All hardware fails, full stop. The question is, when will it fail? And what will be the consequences for your organization? And from that, you can then start to think about how you go about mitigating those risks. You could, for example, say, right, well, if this server goes down, it's absolutely disastrous. So instead of having one server, I'm going to buy two. If anything happens, all of the work, all of the connections, all of the data, instead of running on server 1, will now run on server 2. Any of you that are familiar with RAID will know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't back up your data to one drive, you back it up to 2. And one drive fails, you immediately fall over to the second drive and you keep going. But there's a reason it's called RAID. Anyone know what the I in RAID stands for?
Inexpensive.
So the reason that we can do that is we use the fact that the disks are inexpensive and build in redundancy. We can't say the same for a server. It's not cheap to have a server sitting there doing nothing but having to be paid for. If anything goes down, it's really quick to recover from, but it costs a lot. So what if you, instead of having one on site, say, okay, let's do something similar to the insurance stuff. We will pool our risk, because there's probably other organizations that also need those servers. Instead of everybody having one, why don't we say, right, 20 companies and we'll buy an extra server. We know that if it falls over, the recovery won't be immediate, because we'd have to get the server, plug it in and restore our data. But it'll be a lot cheaper. So it might take us half a day, but we'll save a fortune. Now, in some ways, that's not your call to make. Because depending on your position in the organization, you may not have that authority. What you absolutely do have the responsibility to do is to explain what the issues are and what the possible consequences are. To explain that if you decide to go off-site, it will take longer. And give a realistic expectation of how long it will take for that to be fixed. Computer companies actually sell services based on a number. How long will it take to fix my system? Is it a 1 hour, 2 hour, half day, day, week? And not surprisingly, the shorter the response time, the more expensive it is. Because in essence, what you have to do is pay someone to be ready to respond at a moment's notice. So they are probably sitting somewhere with a van full of spare parts, all ready to come in and fix your system. But these things cost money. So you have to mitigate risk. To do that, you have to think about what the risks are and what the possible consequences would be if that risk comes to pass. But there are calculations to be made in all of them. You have to balance the cost of the mitigation with the cost of the possible failure. And sometimes that might be your responsibility, Sometimes it might be someone else's, but it is definitely a responsibility that belongs in the organisation, and someone should be making that decision. So it shouldn't be something that's just left to chance. It should be something that is flagged up. And it should be flagged up in the risk register that we'll be talking about. And there'll be explanations of the possible issues. Everyone happy with that one?
Yeah.
Any questions just now? Okay.
Nope.
Next one is exploitation. Very topical one, because sometimes there are risks that you have to take. You can't, for example, develop a new drug and not test it. What would be the point? You have to give it to people to see what happens. There's no way around that. There is no choice in the matter. Eventually, at some point, somebody has to get, taking an example purely at random, a new vaccine against a deadly disease. Someone has to be first. It has to be tested. So rather than saying, okay, well, we can't transfer or mitigate or avoid this risk, we have to take it. Instead, what we do is say, right, we're going to take the risk and we are going to closely monitor the result of taking that risk. And once you've figured out what's happened, in this case with a drug, you can think, okay, well, it has not killed the people that have taken it, but on the other hand, it hasn't helped them with the disease. Or there have been some huge side effects, but the disease has been killed. Or if you're really lucky, it's entirely benign for the person taking it, but completely eradicates the disease. So you take the risk, see what happens, and then change your strategy as you get in more data. As I say, for diseases, you can't avoid that. But actually, it applies in business as well. Of course it does. If you have a cafe and you want to make more money, then you probably have to open another cafe. That's a risk. It'll cost you money for your premises and your seats and your staff and your kitchen and your supplies and all the other things that it costs to put together a cafe. That's a risk. But you can't grow your business without taking that risk. So instead you take it, but you monitor it. How many people are coming in? How much money is coming in? How much profit are we making? Or how much of a loss? And if you determine positive results, in this case, the new cafe is making money, you continue. And if it isn't, you stop. You have lost some money, but you don't endanger the whole organization. So you set your limits beforehand. You can do the same. Do you put in firewalls that are hardware based or software based? Which one is more likely to stop DOS attacks? What happens if you get through? What happens if one of the DOS attacks gets through? What's your next move? Sometimes you have to take the risk of that attack happening because your organization needs connectivity. But you have to closely monitor and change if what you're doing isn't working properly. Okay, so that's the 5 main approaches for risk. Accept, avoid, transfer, mitigate, or exploit. Seem reasonable?
Oh, yeah.
Or yeah.
Okay. So if that's the approach that we're going to take, we should probably have a plan. So you think very, very carefully about your organization. You think about everything that could go wrong and you write them down. Here's what could happen. Here would be the outcome of that. Here's what we could do to stop it. This is how much it would cost. This is who's responsible for doing it. It's called a risk register. Now, you will see dozens of different formats for a risk register, but they will have similar information on them. They'll have the risk itself, scope creep, initial plan mistake, server breaks down, supplier increases the price, whatever it happens to be. You might want to categorize them. Is it a financial issue? Is it a resourcing issue? Is it a staffing issue? And then it gets a wee bit more tricky. And this is where the experience comes in. How likely is it that it will happen? 0.25, so that's a 1 in 4 chance. 0.2, 1 in 5 chance. 0.05, 1 in 20. You put a number against them and an impact. Now that could be on cost financially. It could be on cost for staff time. It could be whatever costs you decide are appropriate for your organization and for that risk. And if you've identified the risk, you've figured out what it will be, you should also have a plan to respond to it. And against that plan, you should say how much it will cost. Our server might break down. What are the chances of the server breaking down? Might do it once a year. Once a year doesn't sound too bad. Well, yeah, but when it breaks down once a year, it's going to be down for 24 hours and nobody can do any work for 24 hours. Ah, that sounds bad. What will it cost us? Well, we have options. We can have another server sitting ready to go, but that will cost us another £50,000. Eek. What? Okay, well, we could have another server off-site and that will cost us £1,000 a year. Oh, okay, that's a bit better. And how long would that take to recover? Well, that would be at least half a day. So you just think, okay, £49,000 difference. Is it worth that risk of the half day down? So you work through all your issues, you work through what the possible outcomes are, you set values against them, and you share them with people. Because, as I say, it may or may not be your job to actually decide which of these risks to take, which mitigations to put in place, how much is a reasonable cost, and so on. That then becomes something called your risk register. We'll talk more about that next week. But in essence, all of the things that I've just spoken about should be on that risk register. What are they? What are the possible outcomes, what we're going to do about it, how are we going to check whether that's happened, and how are we going to control any issues occurring. Because not all of these are very simple in terms of putting a number against a server. The risk might be that the system manager leaves, and if she leaves, she takes all the information about the network with her. What plans have we in place to ensure that we have a complete set of documentation about how the network's plugged together, about all the different pieces of software, about all the stuff that needs to be done? Do we have a big folder somewhere with a big checklist saying, well, if we need a new system manager, here are all the things that they are going to need to do? And even if we do, how long is it going to take us to get someone in place? And what will we lose while that's happening? Do we train someone to be able to take over at a moment's notice? Or does that cost too much? You need to think about all of these things. Questions?
Not from me anyway.
Okay, Joshua, anyone else? The rest of you have fallen asleep.
No questions for me.
Okay.
No, I'm fine. I got a question, Tony.
Was that you did or you didn't? Sorry.
I got a question.
Uh-huh.
In the report, if we are not going to be the one making all the decisions when it comes to risk, so I'll just
Really struggling to hear you. I'm just going to turn up my speaker a wee bit and see if that helps. Try again.
The report for the assessment.
Uh-huh.
The risk part of it, if we are not going to be like making the full decision for the company, I would just going to like lay everything out, all the options that are available to them.
Yes, exactly right. So you may not be responsible for taking that final decision about what it is you do, but you are absolutely responsible for explaining what the issues are, what they might cost, and so on. And you'll see that one of the things that's in the marking scheme is for you to actually create that risk register, identifying the issues and what might happen.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay. We're going to do the same as we have in previous weeks. So, sorry, Jackie, are you going to say something?
I was just going to say no.
We'll do the same as we have in previous weeks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this meeting open until, say, 1 o'clock. I will be around until 3 o'clock. So if you need me, just call me on Teams, do a chat on Teams, whatever it happens to be. Send me an email. So I will guarantee to be around until 3 o'clock. What you should be doing in this tutorial time is, as I've been saying all along, the best way to approach this is to start actually creating your report now, or to be precise, 2 weeks ago when we started talking about governance. So given that we've talked about risk this week, I want you to think about risk for your organization. I want you to look at the case study, think about what potential risks that they might have, particularly think about ones in your special knowledge area of IT, but don't only think of those, because remember you're a GRC consultant in this example. So we think about all of them, but it might be helpful for you, given your background, to particularly focus on IT. Think about how you'd approach it. Think about all the risk management approaches that we have covered. So are there things that we're going to ignore? Are there things that we're going to mitigate? Are there things that we're going to embrace? Think about all the stuff surrounding the case study, all the stuff from your own experiences. Think about all the people involved, all the processes involved. What would happen if we lost staff? What would happen if networks went down? What would happen if? Think about all of that stuff. And as I say on the slide, I've just given you examples. That's not an exhaustive list. I want you to think about everything. And then start writing that up as though you were the consultant for this organization. And that will then directly feed into your final report. Any questions about that?
Not for me.
Nope, sounds good to me.
Okay, in that case, what I will do is stop the recording. Oh, things are a bit smoother now. I think my computer's caught up a wee bit. Yeah. Not smooth enough for it to actually show the stop recording menu, but you know, can't have everything.